My life had always been about precision. The careful brushstrokes, the exact temperature of the solvent, the meticulous archival of every finding, every delicate repair. My hands, calloused and stained with resins and pigments, knew the weight of history, the fragile breath of objects that had outlived their creators. I was Reid, and my world was one of restoration, of breathing life back into forgotten beauty. It was a solitary existence, but one I'd chosen, one I found deeply satisfying. Then came the letter from the solicitor, a crisp, formal document that smelled faintly of old paper and stale coffee. It spoke of an inheritance, a distant relative I barely remembered, and a property, a manor, it said, that was now mine. My meticulous nature, which usually thrived on order, felt a tremor of unease. Such an unexpected, sprawling bequest felt untidy. The drive was long, stretching for hours beyond the last recognizable landmark, past fields that gave way to dense, tangled woods. The road narrowed, becoming a cracked ribbon of asphalt swallowed by encroaching brambles and towering, skeletal trees. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. My little hatchback, usually so reliable, seemed to labor under the oppressive silence. Finally, the woods parted, revealing a rusted, wrought iron gate, half-choked by ivy, its hinges groaning like a dying beast as I pushed it open. Beyond lay a winding, gravel path, cracked and moss-covered, leading through an overgrown wilderness that was once surely a manicured garden. And then, there it was. The manor house. It was less a building and more a hulking, moss-draped behemoth of gray stone, sprawling across a rise like a forgotten titan. Windows, dark and vacant, stared out from under heavy brows of crumbling eaves. Patches of slate had slipped from the roof, exposing the skeletal timbers beneath. Ivy, thick as a man's arm, snaked across the facade, prying at mortar, its tendrils like grasping fingers pulling the structure down into the earth. It wasn't just old, it felt profoundly weary, burdened by centuries of silent witness. I killed the engine, the sudden quiet deafening. The only sound was the rustle of unseen things in the undergrowth and the faint, mournful sigh of the wind through the eaves. I sat there for a long moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel, a knot tightening in my stomach. This wasn't a restoration project, it was an archaeological dig. A rescue mission. Stepping out, the gravel crunched under my boots. The air here was different, heavier, carrying the distinct tang of dust, rot, and something else, something metallic, like old blood or forgotten iron. The front door, a massive oak slab studded with tarnished iron, sagged on its hinges. I had to put my shoulder into it, grunting as it scraped across the flagstones with a sound like a cry of pain, releasing a cloud of ancient dust. The interior was a tomb. A grand hall, once magnificent, now lay shrouded in a perpetual twilight. Dust motes danced in the weak shafts of light that pierced the grime-coated windows, illuminating ghostly shapes beneath canvas dropcloths. My breath plumed in front of me. I could taste the dust, feel it gritty on my teeth. My first instinct, as always, was to assess the damage. I started methodically, moving from room to room on the ground floor, each one a testament to long neglect. Peeling wallpaper hung in strips like tattered skin. Furniture, swathed in white sheets, loomed like pale specters. The silence was absolute, save for the creak of the old house settling, or perhaps just breathing. My eyes, accustomed to seeking out structural weaknesses, scanned the walls, the floorboards. I was looking for the mains, the water shut off, anything to bring this sleeping giant to a semblance of life. The corridor ended at a heavy, unpainted wooden door, slightly ajar. A faint, rhythmic thrumming vibrated through the floor beneath my feet, a low, mechanical pulse that seemed out of place in this silent, decaying world. Pushing the door open, I stepped into the laundry room with humming machines. It was a surprisingly large space, surprisingly intact. Rows of heavy, archaic washing machines and industrial dryers, their enamel chipped and faded, lined the walls. They were monstrous things, built for a different era, and to my astonishment, some of them were on. A low, rhythmic growl emanated from their guts, a collective hum that filled the room, making the air thrum with a palpable vibration. Water dripped steadily from a rusty spigot into a ceramic basin, each plink echoing faintly against the mechanical drone. My brow furrowed. Who would leave these running, for how long? The thought was absurd. No one had lived here for decades, according to the solicitor. Yet, the machines were undeniably active, their great metal drums turning slowly, silently, behind cloudy glass portholes. There was no water sloshing, no clothes tumbling, just the dry, empty rotation, the persistent, low hum. I walked closer, drawn by a mixture of professional curiosity and a growing, prickling unease. The air in here was warmer, thicker, carrying a faint, metallic scent that was almost sweet, like ozone after a storm, or perhaps something else entirely. The hum resonated through my palm, a steady, unwavering pulse. It was hypnotic, almost comforting, yet deeply unsettling in its context. My gaze drifted to the back of the room, where a single, bare bulb, miraculously still functional, cast a sickly yellow glow on a stack of neatly folded, white linen. It looked crisp and used, utterly out of place amidst the decades of dust and decay I'd seen elsewhere. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the stack, as if it were breathing. I stared at the linen, then back at the endlessly turning machines, then at the linen again. The hum seemed to intensify, wrapping around me, pressing in. The empty drums spun, an endless, pointless cycle. This wasn't just neglect. This was something else. Something active. Something that didn't fit. The manor wasn't just decaying, it was doing something, and these humming machines felt like its beating heart. And I also knew, even then, that I might not like what I found. I'd spent the first few days simply walking, observing, letting the house speak its own decrepit language of creaking floorboards and groaning timbers. My initial plan was to tackle the grand drawing room, a symphony of peeling wallpaper and shattered plaster, but my practical side overruled the romantic. I needed to establish a base, a place for my tools, a functional space. That led me to the ground floor, past the cavernous kitchen, to a smaller, more utilitarian area. It was the laundry room with humming machines, a relic of a more recent, yet still distant, era. The machines themselves were squat, industrial beasts, their enamel chipped and faded, but they looked robust. More importantly, the room had solid walls, a decent concrete floor, and a single, grime-caked window that promised a sliver of natural light once cleaned. This would be my temporary workshop, a place to begin the painstaking process of restoration. I unpacked my crates, the clink of metal against metal echoing oddly in the confined space. My workbench, a collapsible marvel of engineering, was set up against the longest wall. Brushes, solvents, delicate probes, and a range of chisels, each one a familiar extension of my hand, were laid out with customary precision. The air was thick with dust, disturbed by my movements, catching the weak light filtering through the dirty glass. I pulled on my gloves, a fine mist of disinfectant hanging briefly in the air as I wiped down the nearest surface. The work felt good, a return to the familiar rhythm of cleansing and renewal. The first few hours passed in a quiet industry. I started by clearing away decades of accumulated grime from a sturdy oak cabinet built into one wall. Its surface was scarred, its hinges stiff with rust, but beneath the decay, I could discern the quality of the craftsmanship. As I worked, a low, persistent hum began to emanate from one of the industrial washing machines. It wasn't the sound of operation, more like a dormant beast stirring, a faint electrical thrum that vibrated through the floorboards. I paused, my scraper hovering over a patch of stubborn varnish. It seemed to fade, then return, a phantom pulse in the background. Just the old house, I told myself, settling into its new occupant. Or perhaps the ancient wiring, protesting its long slumber. I resumed my work, focusing on the intricate carvings on the cabinet door. I needed a specific, fine-bladed chisel for a particularly tight corner. I remembered placing it, just moments ago, right beside my solvent tray. My eyes scanned the workbench. It wasn't there. A flicker of annoyance, a mild self-reprimand for my own sloppiness. I must have put it back in the toolbox without thinking. I opened the toolbox, rummaged through the felt-lined compartments. Nothing. My brow furrowed. I was meticulous, almost pathologically so. Every tool had its place. I closed the toolbox, turned back to the workbench. And there it was. The fine-bladed chisel, nestled precisely where I'd first looked, its polished steel glinting innocently under the faint light. My breath hitched, just a fraction. I stared at it, then at the empty space in the toolbox. Had I simply overlooked it? My mind replayed the last few minutes, the certainty of where I'd placed it, the certainty of it not being there. A strange, cold prickle ran up my spine. It was a trick of the light, a momentary lapse in concentration, a consequence of working in an unfamiliar, unsettling environment. I picked up the chisel, its handle cool in my gloved hand, and tried to dismiss the incident. But the hum from the washing machine seemed to grow louder, a deep, resonant thrum that filled the small room, even as the air felt colder, inexplicably so. I shivered, despite the exertion of my work. I could hear other sounds now, too. Faint scratching, like something skittering behind the walls, then a soft, rhythmic drip from somewhere beyond the far wall, a sound that hadn't been there before. It was relentless, an insistent tapping that began to chip away at the edges of my concentration. I stopped scraping, holding my breath. The scratching ceased. The dripping continued. For a fleeting moment, I thought I saw a shift, a deepening of the gloom that wasn't just the light playing tricks. It was too quick, too amorphous to be anything concrete, but it left an impression, a residue of something seen. A sudden, sharp crack echoed from directly above me, making me flinch. Plastered dust drifted down from the ceiling. The sound wasn't the settling of old wood, it was too precise, too singular. It felt like something had been dropped. I looked up, but saw nothing amiss, just the cracked, water-stained plaster. The feeling began then, truly. The sensation of eyes on my back. It was a palpable weight, a prickling awareness that someone, or something, was observing my every move. I spun around, my heart giving a clumsy thump against my ribs. The door was closed, just as I'd left it. The small, grimy window showed only a dense thicket of overgrown ivy. The room was empty, save for me and my tools. I forced myself to breathe, to be rational. This was an old, isolated house. It made noises. Things shifted. My mind, perhaps, was playing tricks, primed by the manor's imposing reputation and its deep, unsettling quiet. I was no longer alone in this house. I was sure of it. And whatever was here, it was taking an interest in my work. Old pennies, I'd thought, left in a forgotten drawer. But as the days bled into each other, that smell seemed to deepen, to gain a subtle, coppery edge. I'd spent the first few days simply walking, observing, letting the house speak its own decrepit language, but now it was time to impose my own. The first order of business, making the place habitable enough for the actual work to begin. I started with the practicalities. Unpacking tools, setting up a temporary workspace in what appeared to be a former scullery, clearing away decades of dust and cobwebs. My hands, usually so precise with delicate veneers and intricate carvings, were instead wrestling with rusted hinges and stubborn window sashes. It was honest, physical labor, a welcome distraction from the oppressive quiet that settled over the house the moment I stopped moving. One afternoon, I realized I'd worn through most of my clean work clothes. A simple necessity led me to the manor's nether regions, down a narrow, winding servant's staircase I hadn't properly explored. The air grew cooler, heavier, as I descended. At the bottom, a heavy oak door, surprisingly well preserved, gave way to a long, low-ceilinged corridor. The hum of machinery grew louder with each step. I found the laundry room with humming machines at the end of the hall. Two industrial-sized washing units, scarred and aged but clearly functional, pulsed with a low, rhythmic thrum. The air was warm, damp, smelling faintly of mildew and something sharply clean, like industrial detergent. I tossed my clothes into one of the cavernous drums, added soap, and pressed the start button. The machine groaned to life, a deep, churning rumble that vibrated through the stone floor. It was then it happened, a small, almost imperceptible shift. I found myself staring at the spinning clothes, a vague sense of unease fluttering in my chest. What was I waiting for? The thought was fleeting, a wisp. I blinked, shook my head. Of course, the laundry. Just tired, Reid, I told myself, rubbing my temples. New place, new routine, too much dust. I attributed it to the isolation, the sheer volume of work ahead. It was a minor blip, easily dismissed. Later that day, I was back in the main drawing room, a vast space with soaring ceilings and windows that overlooked a wild, overgrown garden. My current task was the meticulous removal of layers of faded wallpaper, revealing the plaster beneath. I worked slowly, methodically, steaming and scraping. One section, behind what must have been a grand fireplace, felt different. The plaster seemed to give a slightly duller thud when I tapped it, a subtle variation in acoustic resonance. My restorer's intuition, honed over decades, prickled. I peeled back the final layer of floral paper there, revealing not smooth plaster, but a rough, uneven patch. It wasn't a repair, it was a crude seal. The edges were uneven, the mortar newer than the surrounding wall. My fingers traced the outline, feeling the slight difference in texture. This wasn't just a patched wall. This was an intentional concealment. I retrieved a small hammer and chisel from my toolkit. Carefully, I began to chip away at the mortar. dust plumed with each strike, mingling with the now familiar copper scent that seemed to emanate from the very stones. The work was slow, painstaking, a testament to whoever had sealed this section. They hadn't wanted it found. After what felt like an hour, a section of the plaster, about 3 feet by 2, finally came free, tumbling inward with a soft thump. Beyond it, a cavity. A wave of stale, heavy air, thick with the smell of dried earth and something else, something cloyingly sweet and profoundly old, washed over me. I shone my inspection lamp into the gloom. It wasn't empty. Beside it, a leather-bound journal, its cover warped and cracked. The wood of the box felt unnervingly smooth beneath my touch, almost slick. I pulled it out first, then the journal. The handwriting was cramped, almost illegible in places, faded by time and damp. The forgetting begins. They say the house takes what it needs. The forgetting. My mind snagged on that phrase. A prickle of unease, far sharper than my earlier fatigue, traced a path down my spine. I flipped a few more pages. Drawings, crude and disturbing, depicted elongated figures with blank faces, their hands reaching out. And always, the swirling, jagged symbols that adorned the wooden box. I closed the journal, the brittle leather creaking. My gaze drifted to the wooden box. It wasn't locked, merely sealed shut with its own age. With a gentle push, the lid groaned open. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a single, tarnished silver locket. I opened it. Empty. No pictures, no inscription. I stood there, journal in one hand, locket in the other, staring at the exposed cavity in the wall. Then, I felt it again. A flicker. What was I doing here, precisely? Not in the manor, but in this room, with these objects. The moment stretched, a beat of true disorientation, before my mind snapped back. The wall, Reid. The hidden compartment. The journal. I could feel my brow furrowing, a strange pressure behind my eyes. It wasn't fatigue now. It was something else. A subtle slip in the carefully constructed edifice of my own mind. A single brick loosening. I looked down at the journal, at the word forgetting still echoing in my thoughts. I attributed it to the unsettling discovery, the morbid history now laid bare. What if it was something in the very air of this house, something that seeped into the mind, blurring the edges of memory, eroding the very sense of who I was? The crude drawings in the journal were worse than I'd first realized. Not just abstract shapes, but distorted figures. Faces without features, bodies dissolving into smudges, hands reaching out from what looked like a swirling void. Each one seemed to illustrate a different facet of the forgetting, a visual representation of identity eroding. A cold knot tightened in my gut. I spent the next few days in a feverish, almost obsessive hunt. The manor, I knew, must hold more. Its history was too long, too silent. I started in what I'd identified as the old study, a room choked with dust and the faint, sweet scent of decaying paper. Stacks of leather-bound ledgers, brittle letters, and even a few local gazettes lay buried under decades of grime. My fingers, usually so precise in their restoration work, fumbled through the brittle pages, leaving faint trails of dust. Fragmented accounts, tucked away in the margins of property deeds or mentioned in terse, formal letters between long-dead solicitors. A proprietor in the late 1800s, described as having fallen into a deep melancholy, losing all sense of his own affairs. yellowed and fragile, reported the unexplained disappearance of a young woman who had served as a governess in the manor. Fading. The more I read, the more the manor felt less like a project and more like a trap. My sleep, which had always been sound, became a battleground. Nightmares, vivid and suffocating, seized me. I woke up gasping, the taste of ash in my mouth, my sheets tangled around me like a shroud. The waking hours offered little respite. The first instances were subtle, easily dismissed. But then they escalated. I was in the library, attempting to catalog some of the more salvageable books, when I looked up and saw a figure standing at the far end of the room. Tall, gaunt, indistinct, like a smudge against the gloom. My breath hitched. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and it was gone. Just the empty space, the dust motes dancing in the shafts of light. The memory gaps began subtly too. I'd be meticulously cleaning a piece of furniture, set down my specialized brush, turn to grab a solvent, and then stare blankly at my hand, unable to recall where I'd put the brush, or even what I was doing just moments before. One afternoon, I realized I needed fresh clothes. The dust and grime of the manor clung to everything. The rhythmic thrum and whir of the washers and dryers usually offered a comforting, mundane sound in the otherwise silent house. The hum seemed to deepen, vibrating through the concrete floor, through my very bones. It wasn't just the machines anymore. It was a lower, resonant thrum, like a giant, unseen heart beating beneath the foundations. I closed my eyes, trying to dispel the growing unease. When I opened them, the reflection in the polished chrome of the washing machine wasn't quite mine. My own face, but wrong, impossibly thin, stretched. A silent, guttural scream tore through my throat, but no sound escaped. I stumbled back, tripping over a laundry basket, my hands flying out to brace myself. The reflection snapped back to normal, my own horrified, pale face staring back. The rhythmic hum of the machines continued, utterly indifferent. Had I imagined it? Was I so tired, so stressed, that my mind was conjuring such horrors? I pushed myself up, my legs shaky, and started to gather the freshly dried clothes from a dryer. I pulled out a shirt, then another. My hands paused. There, mixed in with my own clothes, was a small, intricately embroidered handkerchief. It wasn't mine. I had never seen it before. It was delicate, antique, with a faded crest stitched into one corner. I didn't remember putting it in, or finding it anywhere. Where had it come from? How long had it been there? The memory of the handkerchief, the distorted reflection, the fragmented stories of vanishing residents, they converged into a terrifying certainty. I wasn't just restoring a house, I was being consumed by it. I was losing myself, piece by agonizing piece. The forgetting wasn't just a phrase from a journal, it was a process, and I was its next victim. Not just abstract shapes, but distorted figures. Each one seemed to illustrate a different facet of the forgetting. I traced the rough lines with a trembling finger, the parchment feeling strangely cold beneath my touch. This wasn't just a record of decay, it was a blueprint of erosion, a slow, deliberate erasure. I pushed the journal away, the leather cover scraping faintly on the dusty table. My hands, I noticed, were stained with grime and something else, a faint, reddish-brown smear from the old paper, or perhaps from the rust on the iron hinges of the journal itself. The air grew heavier, cooler, and the distant thrumming sound I'd noticed before began to resolve itself into something distinct. The laundry room with humming machines was tucked away in a deep, vaulted chamber, a surprisingly modern addition to the ancient house. The room itself was vast, with high, arched ceilings that dripped condensation onto the flagstone floor. Four industrial-sized washing machines and two enormous dryers dominated the space, their metallic skins gleaming faintly in the single bare bulb that hung from a frayed wire. The air was thick with the scent of stale detergent and the metallic tang of dampness. I tossed my dust-caked work clothes into the nearest washer, adding a scoop of powder from a dented tin. The door clunked shut, the cycle started, and the machine began its familiar churn. I leaned against a cold stone pillar, trying to focus on the simple mechanics, the predictable rhythm. The rhythmic thrumming of the machines began to shift. Or perhaps it was my perception that was shifting. The distinct thumper started to blend, to warp, becoming a low, continuous drone that seemed to vibrate in my teeth. It wasn't just sound anymore, it was a pressure, a physical weight pressing against my eardrums. I squinted, running a hand over my eyes. Not my own reflection, not quite. A smear, a distortion, like a face pressed against wet glass, its features indistinct, dissolving. I stared, my breath catching in my throat. The image was gone, replaced by the swirling gray of the suds and my own pale, strained face staring back. My heart gave a sickening lurch. Was I seeing things? Was this what the forgetting felt like, a slow erosion of perception? They were still spinning, still vibrating, but the sound had been abruptly cut off, as if a switch had been flipped in my own head. The only noise was the ragged gasp I let out. The world tilted. My hands, resting on the cold stone, felt alien, distant. I looked at them, flexing my fingers, trying to remember what they were for, what I was for. My name. Reid. Yes, Reid. The antique restorer. It wasn't a sound from the room, it was inside my head, yet it felt external, an intimate invasion. I stumbled back, hitting the pillar hard. The world spun, the concrete floor seeming to ripple like water. I squeezed them shut, trying to force the confusion away, to anchor myself. Reid. My name is Reid. I'm in the laundry room with humming machines. When I opened my eyes, the room seemed wrong. The machines, though still identical, felt subtly out of place, as if they had shifted an inch or two since I last looked. And then I saw it, not a reflection, not a trick of light, but a presence. It was an absence, a ripple in the air beside the largest dryer, a place where the light seemed to bend and falter. It doesn't just take memories, it takes the very framework of self. It wasn't just erasing, it was replacing. It wanted to wear me, to inhabit my skin, to speak through my mouth. The implication was sickening, a violation far deeper than I could have imagined. My identity wasn't just being stolen, it was being usurped. A sudden, intense wave of nausea washed over me, coupled with an overwhelming urge to simply lie down on the cold floor and let go. Let go of my name, my memories, my struggle. Just cease. For a terrifying second, I almost did. My knees buckled. Who was I, anyway? What did it matter? The manor had always been here. I was merely passing through, or was I? No. A spark, a tiny ember of defiance, flickered within the encroaching fog. I was Reid. I was here to restore this house. It was my inheritance. The texture, the unyielding reality of it. I focused on the loud, consistent thumper of the machines, forcing my mind to accept their sound, their presence, their mundane truth. The presence, the shimmering distortion, seemed to recoil slightly, a barely perceptible shimmer in the air. The bare bulb brightened, though it still pulsed faintly. I was still Reid. Shaken, terrified, but still myself, for now. The laundry room with humming machines slowly settled back into its unsettling normality, but the encounter had left an indelible mark. It wanted me. It wanted to be me. The understanding, that sickening clarity of replacement instead of mere erasure, had stripped away any lingering denial. This wasn't just a house with a dark past, it was a hungry thing, methodically devouring me from the inside out. My skin. My voice. My memories, not just gone, but twisted, overwritten with something alien. A cold, sharp panic, unlike any I'd ever known, seized me. Now. My feet hit the polished floorboards with a jarring urgency. I stumbled towards the heavy oak front door, my breath catching in ragged gasps. I pulled. It didn't budge. I pulled harder, bracing my shoulder against the frame, grunting with effort. The wood groaned, but the door remained stubbornly shut. It wasn't locked, I knew it wasn't. I'd left it unlocked earlier, a habit born of convenience and a foolish sense of security. I pushed, leaned, tried to shoulder it open. Nothing. A desperate, irrational thought flickered, is it breathing? My gaze darted to the windows flanking the door. Tall, narrow panes, overlooking the overgrown drive. I could smash one, but then what? The thought of running through the tangled wilderness, past the skeletal trees, felt impossible. Besides, what if the car wasn't there? Or what if I couldn't remember how to start it? The entity's insidious work had already begun on my mind. Who knew what else it had done to my world? I fumbled in my pockets, my hands shaking. Car keys. Where were they? I always kept them in the same spot, a small ceramic dish on the hall table. I spun around. The dish was there, empty. My mind raced, trying to recall placing them anywhere else. The workshop? The kitchen? A frustrating blank. A phone. My mobile. I remembered charging it in the kitchen, or perhaps the small study off the library. I couldn't be sure. I headed for the kitchen, my steps quickening. The old rotary phone on the wall, a relic I'd kept for aesthetic reasons, hung silently. I snatched the receiver, pressing it to my ear. A deadline. I jiggled the hook, thumped the base. Had it always been like that? I couldn't remember. That was my real lifeline. I retraced my steps, a frantic internal debate raging about its last known location. Was it the study? Or had I taken it upstairs? My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs. It was the laundry room with humming machines. The door was ajar. 2 industrial-sized washing machines and a dryer hummed in unison, their motors a low, droning lullaby. But the machines were empty. Running empty, churning air, their cycles endless and purposeless. The sight was profoundly unsettling. Why were they on? I hadn't used them in days. Had I? This wasn't just things not working, it was things working wrong. I didn't find my phone there. The hum of the machine seemed to mock me, a mechanical heartbeat in a dead house. I tried the study. Papers were scattered across the desk, my notes on restoration techniques, sketches of molding, but no phone. A sudden, sharp doubt pierced through the panic. Who would I even call? The local constable? He'd just laugh, tell me to get some rest. My colleague? I tried to picture his face, his name. It was there, just out of reach, like a word on the tip of my tongue that refused to surface. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing it. His name. His name. Nothing. Just a vague sense of a friendly face, a shared history that was now eroding into a featureless blank. The realization was a new wave of horror. The entity wasn't just blocking my escape, it was severing my connections, erasing the very people I might turn to. It was isolating me, making me an island, before it completely submerged me. I was trapped. My world was shrinking, contracting around this house, around this thing that wanted to wear my skin. And I was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Kitchen, study. Which one? This wasn't just stress. This was something else, something insidious eating at the edges of my perception. The kitchen was empty, silent save for the drip of a tap I swore I'd tightened. No phone on the counter, no charging cable snaking from an outlet. My breath hitched. I retraced my steps, a frantic energy seizing me. The library. I checked the small study off the library, a room usually reserved for old ledgers and forgotten correspondence. Nothing. Just more dust and the lingering scent of aged paper. Panic, cold and sharp, began to truly set in. Where was it? I needed to tell someone, anyone, what was happening, but who? Who was I, anyway? The question, sudden and brutal, made me stumble against a heavy oak chest. I pushed on, my search growing more desperate, my internal monologue a frantic litany of places, drawing room, dining room, the servants' quarters I hadn't yet fully explored. The house itself seemed to shift around me, the familiar angles of the corridors blurring into something less distinct, more labyrinthine. My boots echoed on the flagstone floor, a lonely sound in the cavernous silence. And then, I heard it. A low, persistent thrumming, a mechanical pulse that vibrated through the floor. It was coming from behind a heavy, unvarnished wooden door. I pushed it open, revealing the laundry room with humming machines. 2 industrial-sized washing machines and a dryer, ancient but still functional, churned away, their rhythmic vibrations filling the air with a monotonous drone. They had been running this whole time? Who had started them? I certainly hadn't. On a rickety shelf above one of the machines, nestled between bottles of detergent and a forgotten, crumpled sheet, sat an old, leather-bound journal. It looked out of place, not like something that belonged in a laundry room. My phone was nowhere in sight, but an inexplicable pull drew me to the journal. My hands, trembling, reached for it. The leather was dry and brittle, the pages yellowed and thin. It was a diary, meticulously kept, written in a spidery, precise hand. I recognized the name scrawled on the first page, Elias Thorne. He was one of the manor's previous owners, a reclusive scholar known for his eccentricities. I remembered seeing his name on some deed transfers in the archives. He called it the Devourer of Self. His entries grew increasingly fragmented, mirroring my own deteriorating state. He documented the subtle erosion of his memories, forgotten names, misplaced objects, conversations that never happened. But he also detailed his research, his desperate attempts to understand the entity. It was, he believed, an echo from a time before memory, a primordial hunger that had somehow tethered itself to this land, this house. It didn't consume flesh, it consumed the essence of a person. "It is a parasite," Elias had scrawled in an almost illegible hand on one page, "a psychic leech. It wasn't just taking my memories, it was taking me. It was feeding on the very fabric of my identity, using the house as its hunting ground, its elaborate trap." The architectural changes, the hidden rooms, the shifting perceptions, they weren't just tricks of the light or my own failing mind. They were part of its mechanism, its way of disorienting and isolating its prey, making them easier to consume. Elias wrote of its offerings. It didn't demand blood or gold. It demanded sacrifice. Not of life, but of self. It needed to be given a willing host, someone who would surrender their entire being, every memory, every thought, every feeling, to sate its ancient hunger. It was a ritual of erasure, a complete and utter annihilation of identity. And if no such offering was made, it would simply take, slowly, meticulously, until nothing remained but a vacant vessel. The journal ended abruptly, a half-finished sentence trailing off into a blank page, as if Elias himself had vanished mid-thought. "You cannot. You must outweed it, starve it, or..." I gripped the journal, its brittle cover digging into my palm. The truth, ugly and raw, had been laid bare. I wasn't just losing my mind, I was being eaten alive, piece by precious piece. And the only way to stop it, to truly defeat this thing, required a sacrifice so profound, so utterly terrifying, that I couldn't even begin to comprehend it. I had to offer up myself, or find a way to starve the entity of all that it craved. The truth, ugly and raw, had been laid bare. The words on the page blurred, then sharpened, then blurred again. My eyes stung, not from tears, but from the effort of holding on to coherence. A wave of nausea rolled through me, the metallic tang of the damp air in the laundry room suddenly acrid. The rhythmic churning of the industrial washers and dryers vibrated through the concrete floor, up my legs, settling as a dull ache behind my eyes. My breath hitched, a ragged sound in the close, humid space. The journal. It spoke of an entity that didn't just consume memories, it became them. It didn't destroy, it absorbed, leaving behind only the echo of what was. Like a parasite, it hollowed out the host, then wore its skin. The previous owner, a scholar whose elegant script filled the pages, had called it the mimic. He detailed its slow, insidious process, how it would latch onto a core memory, a fundamental aspect of identity, and slowly unravel it, consuming the threads until the entire tapestry of self was gone. My own dwindling memories, the faces I could no longer quite place, the skills that felt alien in my hands, it all made a horrifying, sickening sense. The scholar had written of his own struggle, of the creeping fog that had begun to claim his thoughts. He'd tried to fight it, to starve it, to reason with it. All in vain. A desperate, almost mad theory. The scholar had realized the mimic couldn't create. It could only replicate and consume. It needed genuine, vibrant essence to sustain itself. What if, he had hypothesized, it could be gorged on something inert? Something that mimicked memory, that held the shape of identity, but was utterly devoid of true life or emotional resonance? A husk, a shell, an elaborate decoy. My mind, a fractured mosaic of half-forgotten details and sudden, terrifying blanks, struggled to grasp the implications. The humming of the machine seemed to swell, a symphony of dread. The scholar's final entries were almost illegible, scrawled with a desperate urgency. But the creation of such a decoy required an immense, irreversible sacrifice. It meant taking a deeply personal, cherished memory, one that defined a significant part of who I was, and systematically stripping it of all emotional connection, all meaning, until it was nothing more than a perfectly crafted, empty vessel. My hands trembled, the journal rattling against the metal sink. This wasn't just about forgetting. If I succeeded, that part of me would be gone forever, not merely forgotten, but fundamentally erased by my own hand. The memory would exist, perhaps, but I would feel nothing for it. It would be a foreign object, a shard of glass in my own history. What memory? What piece of Reid was essential enough, potent enough, to serve as such a bait? My work, my passion for the meticulous resurrection of forgotten beauty, that was it. My identity as an antique restorer was woven into the very fabric of my being. The careful touch, the reverence for history, the quiet satisfaction of bringing an object back to life. It wasn't just a job, it was who I was. What? An automaton, an empty shell myself, perhaps. The plan formed in my mind, terrible and clear. I would take the memory of my first truly significant restoration, the intricate, broken music box that had taken me months to piece together, the one that had solidified my path, and I would systematically dismantle it. Not the physical music box, but the memory itself. I would recall every detail, every emotion, every triumphant moment, and then, with deliberate, agonizing focus, I would drain it. I would turn it into a perfectly formed, emotionally inert lure. The stakes were impossibly high. If I failed, if the mimic somehow saw through the deception, I would simply accelerate my own consumption, offering it the very core of my being on a silver platter. And even if I succeeded, what would be left of me? The alternative was to fade entirely, to become just another echo in this decaying manor, another consumed identity. The thrumming of the machines became a relentless pulse, a countdown. My hands, calloused and skilled, now felt alien. Could I do it? A fierce, desperate resolve hardened within me. The confusion, the fear, the creeping despair, they coalesced into a sharp, singular point of focus. I might be eaten, but I wouldn't go down passively. I would fight back, even if the weapon I wielded was my own soul. The plan was mad, dangerous, and almost certainly irreversible. But it was a plan. And in this house of forgotten selves, a plan was a lifeline. I pushed away from the sink, the journal still clutched tight. The humming of the machines in the laundry room was no longer just noise, it was the rhythm of my final, terrible purpose. The truth, ugly and raw, had been laid bare. The realization, instead of shattering me, solidified something. A cold, hard kernel of resolve. I had spent my life restoring what was broken, bringing forgotten beauty back to light. Now, it was my turn. I would restore myself. I would fight for Reid. My plan, crude as it was, hinged on a single, stubborn fact: the entity fed on memory, on identity. It twisted, eroded, consumed. But what if there was a memory so fundamental, so deeply ingrained, it couldn't be corrupted? A bedrock of self. That moment had defined my path, my purpose. It was the purest essence of Reid. I focused, pushing past the rising tide of fear. The air in the laundry room grew heavy, thick with a scent like old dust and something metallic, like stale blood. My eyelids felt impossibly heavy, yet my mind was sharp, hyper-aware. Not in the dim overhead bulb, but in my peripheral vision. They slithered into my thoughts, insidious and familiar. You are nothing. You were never important. This house. It always belonged to something else. I squeezed the journal, its sharp edges a welcome pain. I am Reid, I repeated, louder this time, focusing on the rough texture of the paper, the faint smell of aged ink. I pictured the small wooden box, its intricate inlay, the way the light had caught the faint scratches on its lid. The feeling of purpose, clear and bright. My vision blurred. The familiar lines of the laundry room dissolving. The washing machines, once orderly rows of metal, seemed to writhe, their doors gaping like hungry mouths. The walls pulsed, the peeling paint shedding like decaying skin. Then came the images. Not memories, not yet. Just flashes. A face I almost knew, twisted in despair. A hand reaching out, not to me, but through me. My mind reeled, trying to anchor itself. What is your purpose? I fought back, clutching the image of the wooden box. I restore. I find beauty in the forgotten. My voice was hoarse, but it was mine. I am Reid. An antique restorer. A jolt. A sudden, violent tremor that shook the entire laundry room. The humming machine screamed, a high-pitched whine that scraped against my eardrums. My own memories, precious fragments of my life, began to tear. I saw my childhood home, but the walls were crumbling, the faces of my parents indistinct, their voices muffled and garbled. This was it. The main assault. It wasn't just my memories it was trying to erase, it was the feeling of having them, the emotional resonance that made them mine. I opened my eyes, blinking away the phantom dust. The laundry room was still there, but warped, stretched, breathing. The floorboards beneath my feet felt soft, yielding, like damp soil. It was a record, a history. A testament. And I was writing my own. I gripped the journal tighter, the brittle paper almost tearing. I remembered the old woman who had given me my first piece, the wooden box. Her kind, wrinkled face. Her gentle smile. Him words, every object has a story, Reid. And every story deserves to be heard. The entity recoiled slightly, a momentary flicker in the overwhelming pressure. It hadn't expected that. A memory tied to another person, a connection. Not just my memory, but a shared one. A tiny chink in its armor. I seized on it. I focused on her smile, her words. I imagined the warmth of her hand as she placed the box in mine. It was a memory not of myself alone, but of connection, of empathy, of giving. This was the truth. This was the reveal. The entity, which fed on isolation and self-erasure, struggled with genuine human connection. Lies. All lies. You are alone. You are always alone. But I wasn't. Not entirely. Not yet. I had the memory of her, and the purpose he had instilled. I had the house, which I was trying to save from this very thing. I had the journal, a physical anchor to a forgotten past, a defiance against oblivion. I stood my ground in the vibrating, distorted laundry room with humming machines, the journal held aloft like a shield. I was Reid. And I would not be erased. The battle was far from over, but I had found my weapon, and I had remembered who I was. For now, that was enough. The hum of the machines in the laundry room was a dull thrum against the soles of my feet, a steady, rhythmic pulse that had become the only constant in a world that had just twisted itself inside out and back again. The violent vibrations had ceased, the air no longer shimmering with that impossible heat. What remained was a cold, hollow space, not just in the room, but somewhere deep inside my skull. I was still standing, though my knees felt like hinges made of wet paper. My hand, still clutching the worn leather of the journal, was trembling uncontrollably. The edges of the pages dug into my palm, a faint, reassuring discomfort against the terrifying numbness spreading through my consciousness. I'd stood my ground. I'd pushed back. The smell of damp linen and stale water, usually so mundane, now seemed to cling to the air like a shroud, heavy and suffocating. My breath hitched in my throat, a ragged, shallow thing. My eyes, which had been squeezed shut against the impossible, now fluttered open, blinking against the stark fluorescent light. The room was just a laundry room again. No distortions, no swirling voids. Just washing machines and dryers, their cycles finished, their work done. Not yet. Or perhaps, I was entirely undone. It was like trying to grasp smoke. There were impressions, a vast hunger, a desperate struggle, the memory of her face, clearer than my own reflection, but the details, the sequence, the why of it all, were dissolving, like sugar in hot tea. My gaze fell to the journal in my hand. This was it. This was my anchor. The physical proof of a forgotten past, a defiance against oblivion. With a profound sense of trepidation, I slowly opened it. My fingers brushed over the familiar, aged paper, the intricate script of the original author. I traced the lines, the looping ascenders and descenders. My own recent editions, scrawled in haste, stood out in stark contrast. I knew these characters were letters. I knew they formed words. But the meaning, the narrative, the very soul of what was written on the page. It was gone. It was like reading a language I had once mastered, but now found utterly incomprehensible. The story of the manor, the tragic lives, the entity's slow, insidious work, it was all just ink on paper. Beautiful, intricate, utterly meaningless. My own notes, the ones I had written in my desperate attempts to understand, to document, to remember, were no better. I recognized my handwriting. I knew it was mine. But the thoughts they expressed, the conclusions they drew, the fear they contained, they felt foreign, like someone else's ramblings I'd stumbled upon. Who was this man, Reid, who had written these urgent warnings? What was this house he was trying to save? I squeezed my eyes shut, a desperate attempt to reset, to force the knowledge back into place. Her story? The connection I'd felt to her plight? Then, a new, more terrifying thought surfaced. If the journal, my physical anchor, was meaningless, what about me? What about Reid? I knew they were my hands. I knew I was an antique restorer. I knew I was in an old manor house, but why? Why was I here? What was I restoring? My identity, once a solid, defined thing, felt like a shattered mosaic, its pieces scattered and many missing. A quiet, desperate laugh bubbled up from my throat, a sound devoid of humor. I had one. I had driven it back. But it had taken so much with it. The cost was paid, and the ledger was bare. The lingering hum of the machines in the laundry room seemed to mock me, a rhythmic reminder of time passing, of a life continuing, even as the essence of my life had been irrevocably altered. I was here. I was breathing. But I felt like a placeholder, a ghost inhabiting a familiar shell, searching for the memories that made it whole. The violent vibrations had ceased, the air no longer shimmering with that impossible heat, that suffocating pressure. A fragile quiet had settled, thin as old glass, over the house. It was over. I had one. My legs felt like crumbling stone as I pushed myself upright. Each movement was a chore, as if the very air had thickened around me. I stumbled out of the laundry room with humming machines, the rhythmic thrum fading behind me, and began a slow, deliberate ascent through the manor. Every floorboard groaned underfoot, every shadow seemed to stretch and recoil as I passed, but the oppressive weight, the malevolent hum that had permeated every fiber of this place, was gone. I made my way to the front door, the heavy oak groaning in protest as I unlatched it. The afternoon sun, weak and watery, filtered through the overgrown trees, painting stripes across the dusty hall. I didn't look back. I just walked. One foot in front of the other, down the long, gravel driveway, away from the looming silhouette of the manor house. My car, miraculously, started on the first try. I drove without direction, just away, the rearview mirror showing less and less of the place until it was swallowed by the horizon. Days blurred into weeks. I found a small apartment in a city I'd never visited, far from the coastal isolation of the manor. The streets were loud, filled with the indifferent bustle of strangers, a comforting cacophony after the insidious quiet I'd endured. I bought new tools, set up a small workshop in a rented space, and tried to fall back into the rhythm of restoration. It was my anchor, the meticulous work of breathing life back into forgotten objects. But something was off. My hands, once precise and steady, sometimes fumbled. My focus, usually a laser beam, would drift, dissolving into a hazy blankness. I'd pick up a delicate porcelain figurine, ready to begin, and then find myself staring at it, unable to recall the specific technique I needed, or even why I'd chosen that piece in the first place. The memories were there, somewhere, like dust motes in a sunbeam, just out of reach. I dismissed it as trauma, a natural consequence of what I'd experienced. My mind was rebuilding, I told myself. It needed time. One evening, I was working on an old wooden music box, its intricate carvings half obscured by centuries of grime. As I carefully cleaned a tiny, almost imperceptible inscription on its underside, a strange familiarity washed over me. It was a symbol, a looping, interconnected knot I hadn't seen before, yet it felt right. Like a forgotten word on the tip of my tongue. I found myself humming a tune I didn't recognize, a haunting, minor key melody that seemed to perfectly fit the ancient wood. I racked my brain, searching through my own internal library of memories. My childhood, my parents, my old mentor. Nothing. The harder I tried, the more slippery my own past felt. Like a perfectly restored antique, buffed to a shine, but with its original patina stripped away entirely. I remembered a specific afternoon, years ago, learning a complex carving technique from my mentor. The scent of linseed oil, the specific curve of his gnarled fingers as he demonstrated. And then, a different memory surfaced, unbidden, startlingly vivid. A low, resonant hum, like the machines in the laundry room, but deeper, older. I saw myself, but not myself, walking through these tunnels, a strange satisfaction settling deep in my chest. My eyes snapped open. The music box was still in my hands. The symbol on its underside seemed to pulse, to draw my gaze. That memory. It wasn't mine. It couldn't be. I had never been in an underground bunker, let alone one beneath a factory. Yet it felt as real, as visceral, as any of my own recollections. I walked over to the small, cracked mirror above my sink. My reflection stared back. Reid. My face. My eyes, but were they? There was a subtle shift in their depth, a flicker of something ancient, something that understood the symbol on the music box, something that knew the underground tunnels. The corners of my lips lifted, but the expression was alien. It felt stretched, unfamiliar, like a mask that didn't quite fit. And then I heard it, a faint, internal echo of that same haunting, minor key melody, playing not in my ears, but in the very core of my being. The entity hadn't been defeated. It hadn't been expelled. It had merely been integrated. It had consumed what it needed, rewritten what it wanted, and left a functional, living host. A host that believed it had one, that believed it was free. The victory was its, not mine. The ultimate triumph of a parasite that leaves its host thinking it's still itself, even as it pilots the body to new pastures, to new opportunities to feed. I looked at my hands, the hands of an antique restorer. But what was I restoring now, and for whom? The truth settled over me like a shroud, heavy and suffocating. The manor was gone, but the entity remained. It was here, within me. I was the new manor, a walking, breathing monument to its insidious victory. I was still Reid, yes, but Reid with an ancient, hungry passenger at the helm, charting a course for places I didn't recognize, for purposes I couldn't fathom. And the worst part? A faint, unsettling satisfaction stirred within me, a quiet, humming contentment that felt utterly, terrifyingly, right star.